Hello, I'm Ed Fuqua, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire, here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
Here for another Conversations. We're still diving deep in the world of mythology, the world of world mythology. After looking at the subcontinent of India, we're now going across the Indian Ocean to Africa to discuss African mythology. And right away when I say that, I'm showing my Eurocentric bias, because there's no such thing as African mythology. Africa is not a country, it is a continent. It's home to many millions of people, and they have a wide array of culture and ethnicity. There are thousands of beliefs in Africa, ancient gods and so forth, and so there is no single one pantheon that covers Africa.
Okay.
It is a wide tapestry of things, of which I can only talk about a little bit.
There's no crossover at all.
There's some, but it's not as much as you would think, because Africa is huge. There's enormous difficulty. The terrain is difficult. They have a desert, they have a rainforest, they have tons of plains and things like that. So there isn't a lot of things that cross over.
Okay.
In Egypt Egypt is in northern part of Africa, although I'm dealing with sub-Saharan Africa for the most part. You had different parts of the country that worshiped the same gods in different ways, but it was all still more or less the same thing. In Africa, there's none of that. So it is an enormously daunting task, particularly since I'm from a very different culture. And I probably have exciting names to mispronounce, which is always fun. Now, Africa, that part of the world, has a very strong storytelling tradition. And all these stories have been told and retold orally, some of them for thousands of years. Unfortunately, a lot of them have also been lost over the years, because the various things that have happened. Some stories have been lost, new stories have been invented. There's still some traditional African storytellers on YouTube actually still doing their thing, which is pretty cool, and especially useful for research purposes. So what I want to focus on first, and it's hard to tell what to start with. I thought of several different ways I could approach this, and it's something that I'm learning basically from scratch, because I'm much more well versed in the European mythological backgrounds than I am Africa. So I decided that the first thing I'm going to do is focus on the Orishas from Yoruba mythology. The particular people, the Yoruba are from what we roughly call Nigeria today. They had a wider range back in the day, and it was unfortunately a part of Africa that was struck very hard by the slave trade. They're on the west coast of Africa, but because of the slave trade, their faith they carried with them across the ocean, and now it's been spread all over the world. So the Orishas are still actively worshipped. It is an ongoing religious thing, and it's worshipped not just in Africa, but in North America, South America, all across the Caribbean. The Orishas are well known. The Orishas are interesting from a mythological standpoint, because technically they're not gods. If you ask many people from Africa, they'll say there's only one god, and that is Odulamare. So in a lot of ways, it is monotheism. There's a single god, Odulamare, but you have the Orishas. The Orishas are often likened to Catholic saints in that they can carry your prayers and your messages to the one God. But they also do a lot more than that, because like many of the Catholic saints, they also have superpowers, and they fight crime. Well, not always. Sometimes they make things miserable for people like other groups of gods. Basically, one person described the Orishas as being kind of like the Avengers. They were ordinary people who had these extraordinary abilities, which they sometimes abused terribly and sometimes used to help people. Now, simultaneously with being ordinary people with superpowers, they are also spirits. Now, in some versions of the story, they all started out as ordinary people and were at some point in their lives, sometimes after their tragic deaths, were brought up by Odulamare and made into spirits and then sent back to the earth as Orishas, so people could communicate with them. And in some of them, they are spirits who manifested themselves in human form to walk among the people. So they're both human and spirit at the same time.
Okay.
In some versions of the story, they're humans, and in some versions of the story, they're just spirits. And I see a lot of like crossover between the two different ways of looking at them that seem to exist simultaneously, which doesn't seem to bother the African storytellers at all, so I'm going to try not to let it bother me. So you have Odulamare, the god, and then all of the Orishas, and there are a huge number of Orishas. And they all have their own complicated backstory, they all have their relationships with each other. I'm going to only focus on a few of them, the most famous ones. So the first one I want to focus on is Ogun. Ogun, which I always mispronounce, I may have it down now, or I may not. He's the Orisha, and I'll slip up and say God at some point instead of Orisha. I know I will, even though technically these are not gods. He's the Orisha of iron, war, and hunting. So as the Orisha of iron, he's very, very important to the people. His sacred symbol is a sword. So if you see a figure of an African deity, a male deity wielding a sword, that's probably Ogun. His worship dates back to when iron was discovered in Africa, which makes him probably about 3,000 years old. That is pretty impressive. Iron was important, and he's the god of civilization, because it was iron that tamed the land. Iron cuts down the trees. Iron shapes the buildings that they live in. Iron plows the fields so you can plant crops. Iron makes humanity exist. So he was very, very important to them. They also were one of the cultures who felt that there was something sacred about the act of creating. And therefore, when a blacksmith forges something in the flames, it's similar to a woman giving birth. You are creating something out of nothing. So Ogun was very, very important. The revolutionaries in Haiti who were overthrowing the slaves, who were overthrowing the authorities and taking over the island, they all asked for Ogun for assistance, and got it because they won their freedom. So there you go. He is known as the Orisha who breaks new ground and overcomes obstacles. So he's the one you call on when you face difficult times. Ogun will be there for you. In some versions of the story, where he starts out as a spirit, he's the first of the Orishas who descends to the earth. And he sees that mankind is struggling because they have like nowhere to live and so forth and so on. So he actually clears the land, it allows people to settle there and plants the first crops for them. So they were extremely happy with this. And he kept working and building them more buildings to live in, and cutting down more trees and things like that. And the worship of the people was just beyond belief. And they kept praising him and saying he was the mightiest of all the Orishas and so forth and so on. And so other Orishas also came down once humanity had spread across the world. However, Ogun, unlike some of his fellow Orishas, did not have a huge ego. He was actually very shy and socially awkward. He felt uncomfortable around people quite often. And the more they heaped praise on him, the more uncomfortable he felt. He was willing to work hard all day to make them happy, but and at one point they decided that they would throw a big feast, a festival in his honor. And that way he would have a chance to relax and enjoy himself. He didn't have to worry about felling trees all the time and making houses for them. However, he became so uncomfortable at the thought of them doing all this for him that he felt guilty. So he left the people and went away to live on the top of a mountain. And the people mourned his loss, and they felt really upset that they'd done something that drove him away. So they prayed to the other Orishas to see if they could get someone to help them. And so, of course, they did. They wound up calling on Oshun. Oshun is a very powerful female Orisha. Oshun's color is yellow. When she wears something, she wears yellow. Beyonce identifies very strongly with Oshun, has mentioned her in song lyrics and frequently dresses in yellow. She was the goddess of love, the goddess of beauty, goddess of congress between men and women. She was very, very good at her job. She's often described as being as sweet as honey or having a honey pot. The honey pot is a metaphor for something you will probably guess. But yes, she was so sweet, she was irresistible, everybody said. So naturally, she's the one that you call upon. She was a very beloved Orisha by all the other Orishas and people and so forth. In fact, the people said of her that if you see a peacock spread its tail, that Oshun had a lover for every eye in the tail of the peacock. So she was very popular. But her life, wasn't without tragedy. She had a fling with Shango, who's another god that we'll get to in a few minutes. Shango is a very powerful, very masculine god. They had a fling, but he didn't treat her very well after that. So she walked out on him. Now, not long after that, she became pregnant. And she honestly couldn't, know which guy was it gotten her pregnant. It might have been Shango's, it might not have been, So she went to the other gods, or other Orishas, for help. And they basically said, well, this is what happens. And she was not very happy with this response. She wanted a little more sympathy from the gods that she'd been so kind to over the years. And she was so annoyed about this that she flew to the moon, as one does, which is when she also became goddess of the moon. So she flew to the moon and gave birth to a child there, and she named the child Ishu. And Ishu would go on to become a trickster Orisha.
What does Ishu mean?
I'm not sure. Because he had no father and no known background. He could be anyone or anything. So he grew up to become their trickster god.
Okay.
Because every pantheon needs a good trickster god. However, without Oshun, things started to fall apart on the earth. Because it turns out, if people are, getting busy with each other, they have time to forge weapons and go to war. So war had erupted all across the land because Oshun wasn't there to calm the guys down and make them all happy.
Oshun, that's the one who wears
Oshun is the
yellow.
goddess.
Right, okay.
Right. So they eventually they petitioned her to come down from the moon and rejoin them, and she did. She was very happy to do so once they understood how important she was to maintaining world order. Because without her, it all falls to pieces pretty darn quickly. So she was the one the villagers called upon to get Ogun down from the mountain.
Okay.
So she, very casually strolled around at the base of the mountain in full view of him, and, some of her clothes dripped off as she danced. It happens. And she drew him down from the mountain, and of course, one taste of her, and he was hooked. So he went back to the celebration that people threw for him, and they say he laughed and smiled for the first time.
Oh.
So it was very good. And they married. So Oshun and Ogun were together for a while. So sort of opposites attract. He gave her stability, and she made him happy. But it wasn't going to last long, unfortunately, because after a while, Shango came calling again.
I see.
Shango was the ex. She should have left him behind, but she didn't. And Shango's told to break them up and convince Oshun to marry him.
Did they?
Yeah. So Shango married Oshun. Shango is a very famous African god, African Orisha. He's the Orisha of thunder and lightning.
Oh.
He is extremely quick-tempered. He's the first one to throw down for a fight every time. His signature weapon is a double-headed axe. So he fights with an axe, he hurls thunderbolts. If he sounds a little bit like Thor,
Yeah, a little
he
bit.
is almost exactly like Thor. But so far as anyone knows, there is never any contact between Africa and anybody from Iceland. As far as anyone knows, it's just a coincidence. Lightning is destructive, a guy with a short temper is destructive. It makes sense sometimes. Shango is very much the alpha male masculine god. If you see images of him on the internet, he's always strutting around, bare-chested with his axe in his hand, with lightning bolts whizzing behind him. Always incredibly handsome. He loved the ladies, and they loved him. He wound up with 3 wives at this point in his story. There is Oba, the Orisha of marriage. I guess she keeps everything calm and settled. And then there was Oya, who was originally a sort of a death goddess. She was the goddess of the last breath that you draw.
Oh.
So her role, I think, was kind of like a psychopomp in Greek mythology, that she was always there at the moment that you died. So she wasn't death itself,
Right.
but she was the Orisha of the last moment of your life.
Okay.
So she had a powerful and important role, but also a somewhat vague and nebulous one. And then Oshun joined, the goddess of love and sex. So it was not a happy relationship. Because Shango became a little obsessed with Oshun, as men tended to do, and wound up spending all of his time with her and ignoring his 2 other wives.
I see.
Yeah. Now, Oba, as the Orisha of marriage, was willing to go along with this in interest of keeping everything happy and keeping a calm relationship going. But Oya was not happy. Yep, she wanted more. So while Shango was getting busy with Oshun one day, Oya started digging around a house and discovered that he had a potion that he used to give him his lightning powers. So she wound up taking it herself. And she became the Orisha of storms, of lightning and thunder and so forth. They share the power. In some versions of the story, Shango is the god of lightning and Oya is the god of thunder. So they always have to work together in the future despite their differences. And some versions of the story, they just both have the same power. Several of the Orishas overlap each other's powers, and it's not divided up cleanly like Greek mythology. It's more organic. In one of the versions of the story, Odulamare handed out powers randomly to people, and some of the Orishas went back and got powers a second time, so they wound up doubling up on them.
Can't say that I wouldn't do the same.
Yeah. So Oya wound up becoming tremendously powerful in her own right. She was still a quasi-death goddess, but now she could also fly and hurl thunderbolts on her own. Her description is almost exactly like Storm of the X-Men.
Yeah.
Deep in my heart of hearts, I want to believe that Len Wein, when he created Storm, did the research and knew about Oya, but honestly, I don't think he did. I think it's yet another coincidence.
Funny.
It just happened that way. But on the internet, when people talk about Oya, they can't resist describing her as exactly like Storm, because she is, except she's more quick-tempered than Storm. She definitely has like an edge to her. As the Orisha of the passing over into death, and also the Orisha of storms, you want to call upon her when there is trouble. But also, it's like one storyteller said, if you pray to her for assistance, and a storm comes by and destroys your house, and it's sitting there in the rubble, and you go, why didn't you protect me? She's the kind of Orisha who will say, well, you're alive, aren't you? Build a new house. Yeah. So with this in mind, in those days, when she first got the power, she became very corrupt with it. And she and Shango kind of fed on each other's quick temper in a way that became very bad for the people. At one time, impulsively, Oya forced Shango to demand that his 2 top generals fight to the death. And they did. And the general that won was so angry at being maltreated that he led a revolution and overthrew Shango and Oya, who were forced to flee. And they realized what a terrible thing they'd done, that they'd gone too far. Now, in this version of the story, they are still human. They're human beings who have these superpowers. But they also realize that they've done wrong. And this version of the story, they commit suicide. They actually kill themselves, but they go up into heaven and are sent back down as Orishas. So you see what I mean when I say the line between a human and a spirit was very, very thin in these stories? Because I'd read that whole story the first time, and I just assumed, well, they were already Orishas. Actually, they were already humans when all of that happened.
Wow.
Yeah. So, so in any event, it's not unusual in mythology to have, like, powerful forces that do terrible things. What's unusual is that the Orishas feel real guilt and contrition when they do wrong. There's another version of the story I decided not to emphasize, in which Shango is ruling as a king, and there is a theory that he was based on an actual ruler who was very quick-tempered and killed a lot of people. Shango was so full of himself that things were very, very bad, and his 7 brothers challenged him for the throne.
7?
Yeah. And so he had a fight, and he hit each of them with lightning bolts and burned them to ashes. And then the next day, he sees all 7 brothers walking down the road, and he says, but I killed you. And the way it works is, Shango was the lightning. So the first brother says, well, I'm fire, you can't burn fire. His other brother says, well, I'm mist, you can't burn mist. And it turns out, wouldn't you know it, each of his brothers actually had something that made them invulnerable to all of his abilities. And then he realized, what a jerk move that he'd done, trying to murder his 7 brothers. And in that version of the story also ends with him committing suicide.
Okay.
So that kind of contrition and guilt that the Orishas feel makes him, I think, kind of unique. You don't see a lot of that.
No.
Greek gods will sometimes notice they've done horrible, horrible things, but not to the extent that the Orishas did. So in a lot of ways, to the people who worship them, the Orishas are very human as well as being extraordinarily powerful. And as I said, they are worshipped all over the world. One article I read said as many as 7 million worshippers, which is a pretty good number. So these are the Orishas of the Yoruba people of Africa. What do you think of them?
I want to follow up because our family's culture lies within that area. So definitely want to follow up and learn more.
Many African Americans trying to reclaim a spirituality they feel that they've lost will turn to the Orishas.
Impressive. Interesting.
Yeah. It's in a way, it's horribly ironic that at the time, the Yoruba people only lived in one part of Africa. And now the worship of the Orishas is, like I said, literally spread all over the world.
Right.
Not that it was their idea, but it happened.
And so unique.
Yeah.
The concept's interesting.
You'll see some similarities with the Loa of voodoo that are also versions of African gods that came over and were changed. I originally thought the Loa and the Orishas were similar to each other. Well, they are similar to each other, but they're from 2 different groups of Africans who interpreted their religion in different ways when they got to the New World.
Okay.
So I thought they were very cool and I wanted to open with them. They're relatively straightforward and simple to understand too.
Okay.
And you see how many, and despite the fact that much of Africa was cut off from the rest of the world, the similarities that we see that's between different religions, trying to lure Ogun down from the mountain, just like trying to lure Amaterasu out of her cave in Japan.
Yeah.
But I know nobody from Japan went to Africa in 3,000 years ago. Because the human race is really all the same. And to a certain extent, we tell the same stories. That's why the same things are happening over and over again in these mythologies, which is why I love mythology so much.
You've been very enlightening, entertaining, interesting.
I'm glad you like them.
Absolutely.
All right, that's all I have for today. We'll have more next week. Until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you next time on Conversations, and until then, be safe.